Hello and welcome to World Talks. My name is Diana Skaya. On Friday, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte joined Supreme Allied Commander Europe General Alexus Grynkewich for a joint press conference following the violation of Polish airspace by Russian drones earlier in the week. Now, Rutte announced the launch of Eastern Sentry, a new military initiative aimed at reinforcing NATO's posture along the eastern flank. Joining me now to discuss the latest details is Scott Lucas, Professor of American Studies at the University of College Dublin. Professor, so glad to have you here with us this morning. Now, before we get into the Eastern Sentry, I just want to ask you a brief roundup of yesterday's UN Security Council meeting that Warsaw called. What are some of the major takeaways that we should know?
Well, I think the council meeting, as quite often, isn't going to significantly change the situation. I mean, the Russians are going to try to deny or wish away their drone incursion into Poland on Wednesday. But I think what was significant in terms of the rhetoric, the statements, was more than 40 countries. That includes, I think, 26 European countries, others from around the world, who said, look, this is unacceptable. What Russia has done, it's a type of aggression that should not be repeated. That was presented to the Security Council by Poland by addressing that. And then I think equally significant was the U.S. acting ambassador coming in and saying, look, the U.S. will defend every inch of NATO territory. That was significant because earlier on Friday, Donald Trump, apparently trying to excuse what the Russians had done, had said, oh, no, this could have been a mistake, to which the Polish Foreign Minister, Sikorski, said bluntly, no, it was not. This was not a mistake at all.
Right. Trump has been giving quite some conflicting statements and, of course, failing to actually blame Putin for that and being very, very vague with his responses. Professor, let me ask you this now. How would you describe the main goals of Eastern Sentry and what NATO hopes to achieve with this?
Well, I think Eastern Sentry is part of a wider effort which has been taken up to protect the eastern flank. We know that and have known since February 2022 with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine that this is not just a threat to Ukraine. It can go beyond that territory, given the Russian track record, to try using hybrid warfare, not just a direct military attack, but cyber operations, for example, maritime operations, disinformation, to try to destabilize the Baltic states, to try to destabilize Poland. To try to destabilize other countries that are on that front line. Now, what has immediately happened, the context for this, and you're showing some images here, is that you have Poland having to respond to the exercises by Russia, by Belarus, Operation Zapad, which occurs every year. But of course, the timing is particularly, pertinent now, given the Russian drone threat. And of course, you have the fact that air defenses are going to have to be bolstered along this eastern flank. In a sense, NATO not only has to draw a line against any further Russian assaults, they have to reinforce that line and make sure that the Kremlin knows it is being reinforced.
I mean, that was my next question to you is what message do you think that NATO is actually sending Russia to this, and how do you think Russia is viewing NATO's decision?
Well, I think Russia's considering its options right now. I think the Kremlin has actually been relatively quiet since Wednesday. You haven't had that type of bluster that quite often comes through the former president, Dmitry Medvedev, shaking his fist, talking about Russia's shiny weapons, including nuclear weapons. I think the Kremlin has been testing NATO. It used the drone incursion into Poland to test, and it got a response from NATO. I think given that response, in combination with the fact that I think the Kremlin faces a number of challenges if it tries to continue the assault on Poland.
Which are what?
And that those challenges, which are military challenges, it's not making that much of an advance on the front line. The challenges of Ukraine's counterattacks, especially hitting the oil refineries, bringing corresponding gasoline shortages, and then the gasoline shortages in combination with other economic challenges, where Russia's economy is experiencing both inflation, but also facing a flatlining GDP. I think those challenges continue into 2026. How much longer can Vladimir Putin maintain the effort to try to conquer most of Ukraine and to try to install a puppet government into Kyiv? I think those chances are going to diminish as the months go on.
Professor, how do these new technologies that are being used in Eastern Sentry improve NATO's ability to deal with modern challenges like drones?
Again, and I don't want to diminish the significance that, this is a full-scale invasion, first and foremost, of Ukraine, trying to break the country. But all wars are testing grounds for new technologies. And I think you have seen that. And you'll see that on the front line with armor, with more traditional ways of waging this, with more unorthodox ways of waging this, such as the small group Russians, for example, on motorcycles trying to get around front lines, but especially drone warfare. I think the change of drone warfare on the battlefield in terms of surveillance, in terms of attacks on ground troops, and beyond that, in terms of attacks on civilians, this is probably the first extended drone war that we have had in the 21st century, and there will be more. And so Ukraine, beginning with Ukraine, but then its allies, including Poland, have got to talk about their own drone technology in combination with other forms of warfare. And that's being done right now in terms of investment, in terms of production, and in terms of military techniques.
Are you saying that Russia will most likely keep continuing to test NATO allies and the West and continue this war further by attacking Poland again?
I think without a doubt. I think, they say about a shark that if a shark stops moving forward, it dies. I think once Vladimir Putin launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, trying to make the conquering of Ukraine his legacy, he can never stop, because if he stops, he has failed. Not just with the attack on Ukraine, his entire legacy has failed. So he keeps attacking Ukraine. He will not cease fire, let's make that clear. And therefore, he has to keep pressure on NATO to try to split NATO allies, to try to back them away from defending Ukraine, and to probe for other weak spots.
Professor, reportedly Belarus warned Poland about incoming drones. How should we read that warning from Belarus?
Belarus has been walking a tightrope. They've been walking the tightrope for 3.5 years now, and that is they have to give some form of support to Vladimir Putin. They are, in effect, a subservient state to the Russians, but at the same time, they don't want to get pulled directly into Ukraine. They don't want to expend their manpower. They don't want to expend their resources. So on the one hand, you make these public statements which say, look, don't threaten us, don't attack us, don't you challenge us. They allow Russia to use Belarus territory for operations, but they try to talk tough so they don't have to get there in on the front lines and cause damage to themselves the way that the Russians have damaged themselves. And I think Alexander Lukashenko will continue to be on that tightrope as long as this invasion of Ukraine continues.
Let me ask you a little bit about the U.S. response to really everything that's going on. I know we touched upon this at the beginning of the interview, but beyond Donald Trump, right? What are some U.S. officials saying about the Russian drone incursion onto Poland and on how Washington should actually respond to all of this?
Yeah, I'm going to say something curious here. Let's stop headlining Donald Trump. Let's stop featuring him, and let's look at the officials who are in the administration. Let's talk about, for example, that partly in response to the drone incursion into Poland, but more broadly, as a sign of support, Keith Kellogg, Donald Trump's envoy, was in Kyiv this week for 2 days of meetings, including high-profile meetings with Vladimir Zelensky. Beyond that, you have two aspects of ongoing U.S. talks with Ukraine and with its European partners. Those talks are over the security guarantees, which probably cannot be implemented until there is a halt to the Russian invasion. But the details of those guarantees are being discussed and sometimes debated. And there has been a renewal of talk on sanctions. Now, Donald Trump had dropped that talk of sanctions when he, as you're showing your viewers right now, rolled out the red carpet for Vladimir Putin on August 15th. But behind the scenes, U.S. officials have gone back to saying to European officials, all right, we have to look at what we're going to do versus Moscow and its trading partners. And publicly, officials like the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, the Energy Secretary Chris Wright are saying, if Europe will take the lead on putting sanctions on China, on India, we will go in as well. We just have to see if Europe will trust the Americans enough. And I know trust is in short supply, but will they trust Americans enough that they would take the lead on imposing those sanctions on Delhi and on Beijing?
Just to go in a little bit further, I mean, I know you said a very important word there, Professor, trust, and it's a little difficult in this case, particularly. I'm not so sure that European leaders have been trusting so much Donald Trump, right, per se, because he's been extremely conflicting with his comments, with his statements, and particularly, like you said, he rolls out a red carpet for Vladimir Putin, and there's actually no concrete steps coming from Trump to really to make sure that, or not to make sure, but at least to do something for Putin to really stop this war, Professor. But I do want to ask you just a little bit more details. How do you really think that, what constructive steps can European allies now and the United States together, particularly after now, Ukraine is one thing, but now, Poland was hit, our region was also hit. What can they do together in response to these airspace violations?
Yeah, look, you can't trust Donald Trump because he spins like a weather vane now, and we know that. What you do is you work with the Trump administration officials, and I'm talking at political level, military level, economic level, so they become the adults in the room who then maneuver Trump and say, Mr. President, Vladimir Putin has disrespected you. Vladimir Putin continues to attack Ukraine civilians. Now he's attacked Poland. So what you do first and foremost is what we are seeing in the past 72 hours, and that is you reinforce, not just with rhetoric, but with measures, the guarantees to every member of NATO that this actions will not be tolerated. You back up those guarantees with resources, and we have already seen Germany, the Netherlands, other states who have said we're going to increase our contributions to air defenses for Poland and by extension for other NATO allies on the front line. And then beyond reinforcing those air defenses, you talk about the status that you have in terms of your ground troops, in terms of your maritime troops. You, in effect, put yourself in a position to respond to any provocation that Russia might carry out. And then you go beyond it. You have to, and I'm going to say this quite bluntly, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. It won't be a member of NATO for some time, but you cannot guarantee the security of NATO members if you do not guarantee Ukraine's security. If you do not back Kyiv, Russia will use that and will exploit that to continue to try to destabilize you.
Sure. Well, let's end this interview with exactly your concluding statement. Thank you so much, Professor Scott Lucas, for being with us here on TVP World this morning.
Thanks to you and your great viewers.
And that's all for this edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm Diana Skaya. Thanks for watching. Stay with us for more on TVP World.